I'm Stephen Charles Jaffe. I'm the COO of Springbok Entertainment, the co-founder. I produced a movie called Ghosts and Strange Days with James Cameron, several other of Catherine Bigelow's movies. I got into the empathy business unfortunately through my daughter having cancer when she was 15 years old. At that time, she was cured by a doctor at Children's Hospital named Stuart Siegel, and to show my appreciation for him saving her life, I made a PSA fundraising film for the hospital and for Dr. Siegel that raised $120 million. Last year, my partner, Brandon Zemmel, and I went back to Dr. Siegel, told him we were working in VR and we wanted to do another fundraising experience, but this time using virtual reality. And he had just founded a new program at USC Norris Hospital called AYA at USC, Adolescent Young Adults Who Have Cancer, ages 15 to 39. And when my daughter had cancer, that term didn't exist. DNA banking didn't exist. And, but basically, people from that age group find themselves, unfortunately, between children's hospitals where they shouldn't be, because my daughter, like a number of other teenagers, found herself in a room full of 2-year-olds and wondered, why am I the only person? Why am I the only teenager with cancer? And I said, I'm sure you're not, but I didn't really have an explanation. And the worst thing would have been if she had been in an adult hospital for treating cancer, because that's even more ostracizing. Anyway, long story made short, I've been in the empathy business longer than I care to admit, but here we are, and we have this wonderful opportunity with VR and AR to use it to promote social change of many, many different types. So without further ado, because I'd really like to get into the meat of this discussion, let me introduce our panel. First of all, Elijah Allen Blitz, Director of VR Experience for Ken Burns News. I'm going to let everybody tell you more about their work and what they're doing, but I just want to get the introductions done. Ian Forrester is the Chief Operating Officer, co-founder of VR Playhouse. Next to him is Lori Kozłowski, producer of Project Empathy, and my partner, Brandon Zemmel, CEO, co-founder of Springbok Entertainment, and next to him is Joey Caroni, Director of Digital Media at KCRW. So I'd like everybody to reintroduce themselves, tell the audience a little bit about what you've been doing.
All right. What's up, everybody? My name's Elijah. I direct virtual reality, and my most recent project is actually with this guy. We made a piece for Time magazine called Defying the Nazis. It was based on the most recent Ken Burns film. But me personally, I'm a freelance director, and I mostly focus on VR projects that somehow elevate consciousness and raise awareness about socially relevant issues. So that's my mini what do I do.
Hey, I'm Ian Forrester. I'm the Chief Creative Officer and co-founder of VR Playhouse. We're a full-service creative studio and production company. We focus on making original content and content for clients at our studio in Glassell Park. We've been around since 2014, and we're really excited this year to be rolling out our first slate of original content. So yeah.
Hi, I'm Lori Kozłowski, and I am the producer of Project Empathy. Project Empathy is a combination of virtual reality and looking at the mass incarceration issue in the United States. So ultimately, Project in total is 4 VR shorts about different issues around the US prison system. By trade, I am a journalist, and so these films take on sort of a documentary feel, although some of them are biographical and some of them are scripted. But we wanted them to be as true to life as possible to help bring the issue of mass incarceration to a larger public and to policymakers.
I'm Brandon Zamel. I'm the CEO and co-founder of Springbok Entertainment and co-founder of Springbok Cares, a nonprofit. Springbok Entertainment has produced and financed quite a few pieces relevant to the panel. We produced a documentary on the northern white rhinoceros, the most endangered species in the world, shot in Kenya. We premiered it at Tribeca. We're the first partners, creative partners for Google Expeditions, where we did a series on the refugee crisis in Germany. We did a series on the Hadzabe tribe, one of the last nomadic tribes in the world in Tanzania, as well as a series on global warming's impact on agricultural practices in third world countries. Springbok Cares is a nonprofit that brings immersive technology programming to hospitals for hospital patients. We recently announced a few weeks ago that the first program will be launching at USC Keck Medical Center, where we're going to have the capability of hosting over 400 patients and patients' loved ones a week. So it's a pretty big build out that we've been working on a long time, and we're really excited to share about it.
Hi there, I'm Joey Croney. I'm the head of digital and creative at KCRW. KCRW is a nonprofit NPR affiliate station here in Los Angeles. We've actually produced about 50 VR productions over the last 13 months or so, predominantly in entertainment. I think our goal in participating in panels like this and being part of the community is really helping to mainstream VR and increase the audience and distribution, really, and to give projects like this a voice. So happy to be here with these guys and ladies today.
Great. Let's talk about how you get people to watch your VR experiences, and then we'll talk about how do you get these experiences financed.
You make it good. And I mean, like, in a real way, you make it like a good thing where they feel good watching it. I think that a lot of our there's something interesting that I've noticed that happens in framed media versus immersive media, and this started, my background was in theater and starting to move into immersive theater. When I figured out, I just sort of dropped everything and started doing VR as soon as I found out it existed. So you make them feel good, you give them status, you give them some kind of pleasure experience. The embodied consciousness of the VR viewer wants to be honored and is in a position to be honored. Whereas it seems that the disembodied viewer of the framed media experience wants to see something, kind of wants to be beaten up a little bit or battered around. I sort of, one of the things I think about a lot is the moral obligation of the viewer in a VR experience. And maybe this is an interesting jumping off point for Brandon, the work you're doing. When you're in a situation where you have no agency, you're relieved of your moral obligation to act. So if I'm 4 blocks away and I see a car accident through a window, I can look at it and the thought is, oh, someone will help them, I can just watch. Or maybe I should make a call, right? I don't know, maybe I just admitted to being a terrible person, I'm not sure. But if I'm standing on the street corner, chances are I'm going to leap into action, I'm going to be pulling people out of cars, I'm going to, be calling the cops right away. Like, there's going to be no hesitation towards that. And I think, to me, that's the difference between framed media and immersive media and VR.
I think to add, Ian, to what you're saying, I think it's about a call to action. The feeling good is not necessarily that you're telling a feel-good story as much as you're empowering the viewer in a way that says that there's a level of emotional investment that you're tapping into that immersive technology has the capacity to do. And I think you see a lot of pieces in this space that they recognize the potential power of it, but oftentimes they don't take that next step of saying, and you can do something about it, right? In fact, Lori, you guys with Project Empathy, one of the things that I had noticed was what you guys have planned in March that I thought was a really cool aspect to what you guys have put together.
Yeah, so with Project Empathy, we are, one of the goals, besides showing people what mass incarceration is and what inmates and former inmates go through in the United States, the idea is to get this content in front of policymakers and politicians to actually affect public policy and laws being changed. So we have something called Day of Empathy through Van Jones' organization Cut 50, which is interested in mass incarceration and reducing it in the United States, and wanting to get the VR shorts in front of politicians sort of in each state on March 1st. And already what's great about his team is we've taken the content we've already made and we have taken it to Washington. So Cory Booker's seen the content, Newt Gingrich has seen the content, and we really just sort of, beside the general public and making the content good, we want to make sure that people can actually make policy changes on our behalf also see this content. Something I did the majority of the research on the prison system and with former inmates for the last year, and I think that what was humbling for me is that it's a much more complicated issue than I think the average person realizes, and probably even more complicated than most of our politicians recognize as well.
That sounds amazing. It sounds like a great series. I can't wait to see it. My question, though, is how do you get the average person who is curious about VR, doesn't have a headset, how do you bring the masses to an important program like that, or any of the programs everybody here is working on? And how do you accelerate that?
I think part of it is recognizing, finding the balance as a creative and a storyteller of the tools that you want to use, and making sure that you don't lose sight of what your message is, right? Which you need to get it into people's hands. So in conceptualizing what that experience is going to look like, part of it is having an understanding of the tools that are available to you and being strategic in the way that you use them. I want to throw this over to Joey. I'm kind of teeing you up for this because I think KCRW's strategy is a really smart one.
Education and curation and distribution partners. You got to get that aha moment, which everybody experiences when they first put a headset on. We do that with entertainment. So we've recorded about 30, 35 musicians coming in and doing live sessions in the studio as a VR single. We're growing our audience with the entertainment content to then sort of spoon feed more of the change agent storytelling narrative stuff. And I think in addition to that aha moment and sort of breaking down that sort of barrier to entry with sort of getting people to experience it, I think you have to really reach out to curation and distribution partners. You need people that are going to sort of suggest your content to their audience and help distribute it. And I think that's one of the great things about VR content is some of the panel and I were discussing this morning, it is very much still a community. There is not this sense of competition that is typically rife in Hollywood. So you have a lot of people that are willing to sort of co-distribute content. And I think those relationships and partnerships are going to be critical to mainstreaming VR, is that we maintain that sense of community and cooperation and share other people's work as equally and as passionately as you would share your own.
Elijah, I was just going to say, I mean, you're fortunate enough to be associated with Ken Burns, who is an icon in this world. How are you using that association to make people aware of your experience?
Well, we're using, I mean, obviously just having Ken Burns' name attached to something makes people aware, and having, Time Magazine and PBS to help distribute it. One of the things, though, using that even to answer your initial question, agreeing, with what everyone's saying, I think another way, at least in the current state of things, to help get other people to see these experiences is by having a 2D companion piece to go along with it.
Yeah.
One of the things we did with the last project is we got one of the Holocaust survivors to watch a recreation of her rescue in VR. and then film that, and then have, you know, that experience. That video kind of went viral on Time's website, and they did a whole story about it. So that, right, at least right now in this current state of things, when still more people are watching 2D videos, most people don't even know they have 360 capabilities on their phones, you know? When people aren't aware of that, it's to show them stuff that they're used to, and then say, oh, guess what? Do you see that thing she's watching? You want to watch it? Then, like Ian said, make sure it's good.
You know, it's interesting because when Brandon and I were discussing our AYA program, I said, based on my experience with the previous PSA for Children's Hospital, we're going to have to do a 2D version because there's going to be, first of all, I'm soliciting funds for a hospital. I have to pull on people's heartstrings, get them to write a check. But I knew the 2D version was going to be instrumental in getting them in the door. But our VR companion piece, which I naively thought, oh, I'll just recut it with the wide-angle shots, so it'll be easy. But then we realized in discussing this, it had to be a completely unique VR experience. But to get them in the door, we still have to rely on old traditional techniques.
To go back to Ian's point too, you know, this often comes up on a lot of panels, and it can't be reiterated enough. Which is, if you're considering doing something in VR, you know, using some kind of immersive tech, you got to ask yourself why. And if it's simply just because it's the latest, greatest tool, or you know, you really want to experiment with it, you're not doing yourself or the medium or your cause any favors. There has to be something that enhances what your message is. Otherwise, you shouldn't be doing it in VR.
I want to jump in just real quick because I think I want to just add two things. The first is we've had two projects now come through the door where somebody's come in with the idea, and this is not the piece with Time, but or two projects where somebody's come in through the door with a 2D project saying, I want you to make a VR companion piece, and then the VR companion piece has become the primary project, and the framed piece has become they've just changed their status relationship. And it was really interesting to see. And I think that has been a learning for us in terms of like, well, you know, you can sort of almost do like, you almost have to sort of know that you're going to be playing a shell game at some point. Like, okay, I'm going to come in with my movie, right? Because everybody knows movies. And then I'm going to come in with this little VR thing over here, but then just know that like the VR, everybody's going to get way more excited about the VR thing. And be ready for that to sort of take the top spot. So I do think, companion media is really is a really good way to communicate because there are so many great platforms for it. One thing that we're doing is we have a mixed reality lab. So a mixed reality lab is we're able to film people who are inside of an experience, inside a virtual reality experience, and then composite their real life with the virtual life. So it's what's really happening in the room in this reality, and then what's happening in their virtual reality mashed together. So no longer is it a Facebook video of somebody flailing around in a room, you know, looking sort of foolish. It's somebody in an environment that you can make sense of and you can see, and you get FOMO about it. And the people watching it say, oh, I want to be inside that. So this is something we did for the piece with Amelie was we filmed her watching the piece and then composited her in the experience at that point. And those are some of the most powerful shots of the framed video. So I think that's another compelling way to communicate the experience of VR.
If you want to see a good example of what Ian's talking about, for those that are unfamiliar, if you Google or go on YouTube and type in tilt brush, pretty much any official video that Google has released for their painting virtual reality app will be this technique that Ian's talking about, and will give you a very good idea. What you're actually watching is the actual performance of the painter using green screen. And it'll give you, an idea of how you observe someone in a VR space in, a traditional framed version.
Just a side note on that, that's really cool what Brandon said. There's a video online of one of the original Disney animators in tilt brush. He's painting in three-dimensional space, and he paints a three-dimensional Beauty and the Beast and Little Mermaid, and then can walk around and interact with it. Like what he created, he brings to life in front of you. Anyway, just is cool.
Yeah, we love Tilbrush. We want to live in Tilbrush. What's interesting, Time Magazine worked with you guys. Did they reach out to you, or did you reach out to them? How'd that happen?
It was sort of this really great kismet partnership. Time came to VR Playhouse and said, we're launching a platform. This was back in, I think I can talk about this now. I'm so excited when I finally get to talk about something because so much stuff is like under wraps. So yeah, they came to us earlier in the summer and they said, hey, you guys make VR stuff. We are launching a VR platform. What do you got? And gave us their rollout calendar, and we looked at all this stuff, and we were like, okay. At the same time, Elijah came to us and was saying, hey, I want to do this companion piece for this Ken Burns documentary that is coming out on PBS in the fall. And the timing was really lined up, and so we're like, okay, well, what if we made this a launch piece for Time for Life VR? And so VR Playhouse kind of put those pieces together. And Time was excited, and Elijah and Ken and Artemis, who's the creator of the documentary, were excited, and it just was kind of downhill from there.
I think it's interesting that some of the old media giants like Time, like Condé Nast and New Yorker, have realized that the writing's on the wall. People aren't going to be buying hard copy magazines or newspapers, and I find it kind of optimistic to see that they're doing that and they're not just putting their heads in the sand, or otherwise they'll...
What's really interesting about Time is that they relaunched their Life VR brand, which, do you remember what the quote is?
Which one? Oh,
Something like...
the mission statement?
Yeah, the mission statement for Life. Look up the mission statement for Life and the Life
original
magazine.
Life
and then
magazine
think about
mission statement. It's amazing. It's basically like a VR experience. It's like to take people to new lands where they've never been and show them new reality. And
so Life was doing it with photos, which was the most immersive, widely distributable technology of its day. And now here Life comes and is saying, oh, well, we're going to do it in VR.
Yeah, similarly, with Project Empathy, we premiered one of the VR shorts with The Atlantic at their Race and Justice Summit, and they were awesome media partners in terms of getting really excited about wanting to show their audience and their sort of tastemakers and their audience VR. So it's one of the oldest magazines in the country, but they still have that sort of tastemaker brand, and I think they want to be ahead of the curve when it comes to what's next. So
it's interesting that you mentioned Life magazine. I was lucky enough when I was a young kid. My father was a literary agent, and in the 50s, and he represented a number of prominent writers. But one really special client of his was Margaret Burke White, who was the original photojournalist for Life magazine. She took the first cover for them, and she continued to do a lot of work for them. And there's a couple of things I want to bring up and open up to you guys to talk about. One is the role of photojournalists in VR documentaries, because Margaret Burke White was unique in that she was a great writer and she was a great photographer. And today there are very few people that have both of those talents. You're either a great photographer or you're a great writer. What kind of opportunities do you think there are for not just photojournalists to evolve into this space, but women? I mean, Margaret Burke White, when she did this, it was unheard of, just unheard of. And today, obviously, this is a prime focus of discussion and what's fair and unfair opportunities for women, for minorities, et cetera. So I open it up to you guys to talk about that.
well, I'll jump in as the only woman on the panel. I think that
Oh, I want to explain it.
ultimately, thanks, Kanye. I think that ultimately, if you dig into the history of VR, actually, which we've done, a lot has been done by women. So Nani de la Pena, who's considered the godmother of VR, is one of our directors, and her mentor, Jackie Mori, is actually a real groundbreaker in the space. So there's a lot more that's been done in VR by women than I think is known about. So I don't know that it's quite as, I don't think women have taken a back seat in this medium. I just don't know that it's been shouted about. I also
I
think
think you have to shout.
We're helping shout about it. We're doing
Thank you.
coverage on women in VR, and it does seem from our experience that VR, again, as a community, is actually a lot more open and embracing. At the most recent Oculus,
totally.
they had a diversity project manager who was a woman come out and actually give a sort of a dissertation on their efforts in diversity, and that was at a keynote of a major tech company, which is typically sort of the norm, but you look at it as being the norm today, whereas 5 years ago at CES, you would be hard-pressed to find a female executive in a booth or on a panel. And I think VR is actually taking strides to sort of break down those barriers early in the industry.
I agree. Yeah, it seems like a wide open space. So if you're a girl, if you're a woman and want to get into VR, like go for it. It's very. It feels like the playing field's very level at this point.
Well, and there's a lot of grants out there that are set up specifically for diversity and sort of people that are a little disadvantaged in terms of the tech and the hardware access and software access. And I think that's one of the things that we encourage everybody to take advantage of because it is there. The money exists. People are committing to it. And I think Oculus, don't quote me on this, but I think it was $50 million or $100 million was set aside just for more than that. I'm seeing more. 150? Am I getting closer? 250, thank you. $250 million set aside for diversity filmmakers and storytellers. Thank you. Sure.
The other thing is, too, there's some really amazing events and groups that are out there that essentially are bringing people together. One in particular is there's a really active Facebook group called Women in VR that I'm actually a part of as an observer because the discussion that goes on there is incredible, really talented people. But I think one of the amazing things that's happened in this medium is because there is this kind of anarchist component to it, it's allowed people to define it. The same boundaries aren't as much there as with other aspects of the technology or entertainment business. And the result of it has been this incredible surge of diversity and unique voices that are contributing to the growth of what's happening here.
Joey, I want to ask you a question. How far away are we, or is KCRW, from the point where Madeline Brand, Warren Olney will be doing a parallel VR broadcast of what their shows are?
That's a great question. We have the tech, we have the know-how, and we have the talent. What we don't have is the audience. And I think, when we deal, especially being a nonprofit, we have to make sort of these resource decisions based on reach. And unfortunately, our reach in sort of this space, in this medium, is still fairly limited. And that's why we're really taking the sort of approach of trying to mainstream it and educate the audience as much as we can, increase adoption, carry other people's content, push the industry, because frankly, the tech is there, the audience just isn't quite there yet.
How much is NPR as a nationwide organization helping you?
You're going to get me in trouble.
You can take the fifth.
To my knowledge, NPR has done one VR production, and it was I believe it was a Tiny Desk concert, and that's it. And there's no plans strategically for NPR to do anything in VR at the moment, other than sort of one-off experiments. And I think that speaks to traditional media that we were just sort of talking about. I think there has been some embracing from traditional media of sort of one-off projects. What we're not seeing is sort of a committed distribution strategy with traditional media and VR. And that's one of the things that we're trying to do at KCRW is just stay committed and keep pushing out VR content on a monthly basis, have a presence at conferences. You don't see other radio stations, you don't see other media companies here. We had a booth at VRLA. I mean, this is what we're trying to set an example a little bit in the industry to help sort of get the word out, really, is what it's all about. But I mean, unfortunately, NPR does not have any strategy around VR at the moment.
So I guess Congress and the Senate is not authorizing any bills for VR education.
Video is a challenge for NPR in all formats, and sort of wrapping their head around that. And I think it's really going to be up to sort of member stations in the NPR community, like KCRW, to sort of set an example and give them a model that they can follow.
Right.
You know, I want to echo that because I've noticed that a lot. There are a lot of companies out there, like we've had very little kind of repeat business, and it's typically because where the market is now, the audience isn't there. So the people who are creating content, and it's interesting because like we've been seeing it grow. You know, we started 2 years ago when like there was a DK, the DK2 had just come out, I think. It's so funny. It's like
Back
dog
in the day.
years in this
I know,
industry.
right?
And so I think a lot of the people who are making VR content at this point, it's a lot of positioning. It's to be able to say, oh, I made a VR back in 20, whatever,
We were one of the
15 or
first.
14. Yeah, we were one of the first. We were doing that. But they make one thing, and then they're just like, okay, that's our VR thing. And then, there's not yet a real appetite there's not like an appetite that needs to be, fulfilled on the part of audiences yet.
Have you gotten the question, from potential clients or collaborators, how much does 5 minutes of VR cost?
All the time. All the time. And I'm like, okay, well, look at 5 minutes of My Dinner with Andre and 5 minutes of The Avengers and tell me the cost difference between
And these questions are coming
those
from
two.
educated people. I mean,
Yeah.
this is not...
It's the same
yeah.
thing.
Yeah.
Well, I always got that question as a producer of film, and it's like, where's the script? What, how many shooting days? Who's directing this, et cetera, et cetera. If you can't answer these questions, don't ask me a stupid question like that. Let's go back to traditional tools to cover our rear ends to make sure what we're doing in VR does get exposed. Now, we were talking about having a 2D version to get the uninitiated in the door. What Brandon and I have found, and it's kind of great how quickly the tech is evolving, because we had a number of people say, well, not only do I not want to put on a headset, but I want to experience this with my friends. I want to get back to the movie experience, collective enjoyment or grief or emotional experiences with a group. So obviously we looked into domes, and that's a whole other area that's really interesting. It's not quite as immersive. I don't think it ever will be as putting on a headset, but we have to be realistic. And again, we're trying to cast the largest net. What are your experiences with projection domes or things like pufferfish, which are beautiful eye candy? And clearly when anyone has a dome exhibit at a convention, it's like a magnet. Everybody goes to it. And pufferfish and those beautiful globular fish tank things, also eye candy, but how effective are they, and what are you guys doing with that type of projection?
Well, I mean, I was just talking with Ted Shilowitz last night from Fox, and they just had released the most recent Star Trek film in this, not 360, but it's 180, and it's this whole screen, and it just goes around like this, so it's just to immerse you in it. And they're experimenting with that because they know that not everybody wants to put on a headset. So, I mean, me personally, I'm working with a friend of mine named Louis Schwartzberg, who's a time-lapse photographer on the more like immersive dome kind of thing, not full-on size of this room dome, but something that probably 5 to 6 people could experience together. It's one of those things though that I would more focus, when it comes to that, I would more focus on the content. I mean, it depends more what you're creating.
Well, I'm assuming everything's first-class content, but
Yeah.
still,
No, but even with that, some content, I feel like you said, it's more intimate and needs to be. You can't, that the whole solitary confinement piece that they showed at the White House, you can't show that in a dome, Yeah.
Yeah, did you see the 6x9 piece by The Guardian about solitary confinement?
I did not.
So The Guardian back in April released, it was a project funded by Google. It's to bring the idea of solitary confinement in the United States to the masses, or as many people that could see it. It's called 6x9 if you get a chance to see it. I actually saw it for the second or third time last week at Paramount, and they actually put you in, speaking of an experience, they put you in a box that is the size of a cell, that would be the size of your cell if you were in solitary confinement. And it does change the experience a little bit, because you feel like
you're sort of in there, you know? And I know what you mean about projecting out so you don't have to put a headset on, because even with 6x9, they did borrow audio footage from Frontline PBS that recorded inmates and what it actually sounds like in a solitary confinement walkway. So you hear people screaming and guards shouting, and it's scary. It makes it very scary. But I could imagine this in a 360-degree environment without having the headset on. And I will say, from seeing a number of VR pieces, what ends up happening is it can weigh on your cheeks a little bit after a number of minutes. And I think the average viewer, as you've said, they'd like to see it with their friends. And especially when we're talking about issues like prison or the Holocaust, or things that people need to have discourse about, it's very important for them to be able to also see this with other people, to have dialogue about it. So I think that however we can make those 360 environments possible, it could be a good step.
I want to use this moment to talk about sound, because sound is something that, you know, every time we go to a seminar, it's like the last question, oh, sorry, we don't have time. But in your specific case, I imagine sound plays an enormous importance to making one feel like you're in that prison.
Yeah, so the 4 films trace different parts of mass incarceration. One is about, we didn't do solitary confinement because The Guardian had just done it in the middle of our production. But we did a piece on being left behind and what happens to children when they see their parents arrested, and the children who are left behind and what happens to the rest of the family. Most of the filming happened in North Hollywood. Wendy Calhoun, who's a co-executive producer of Empire, was actually the director on that piece. And beside being on the playground and having that 360 sound around about what it would sound like on a playground, or what would it sound like to have your mother arrested in the police, it was really important for Wendy to have us go back and find the voices of real children who have seen a parent arrested or taken away, and how they feel about it. And so we also recorded voices of real children, and in some cases grown adults, who did have a parent that was taken out of the home due to arrest and incarceration. Adding those voices to the piece and having that real life reality check versus just thinking you're just in a little bit of a movie, I think it does help. But there's also teams we're working with. Ariel Soundworks, which is really about VR 360 sound, and it's just a key component of making the medium, as you said, like make stuff really good, and sound is part of it.
It was also interesting for me, Brandon actually pointed this out, that, you know, it's not just putting you in that space, but it's directing the viewer where you want them to look if you don't have a visual cue. And you know, we were one of the first companies to use the early Nokia Ozo, and you know, the shock of my life, I grew up in traditional film, and you know, I had a cut that I had shot designed to have an incoming shot continue the screen direction right to left. And the editor said, it's never going to work. I said, what are you talking about? I said, we got to flop the shot, have the horse and the rider going the other way. And I said, that's the worst cut ever. And he said, yeah, but you just put the viewer looking off to the left. How are you going to get them to know where the horse is coming? We flopped the shot, and I go, oh, okay. This is actually what's so exciting about the medium we're working in, is whereas years and years ago when I first got into movies, it was like, how do we break these rules? Here we're making them up as we go along, and we're figuring this stuff out. And quite honestly, I think, you know, people new to VR have to embrace the unknown instead of being afraid of it. And all these things that we're trying, I mean, I think you have to say, hey, it's a medium where you get to try things. How many times did we always want to be able to try things, and we're told, no, you can't?
I actually want to go back to the domes thing, because I think it raises an interesting point. And I was just with you know, Ed Lentz and Mindy Lipschultz. Anyway, they're two, like, if you're looking for domes, Ed Lentz at the Vortex Immersion Dome and Mindy Lipschultz. So Ed makes domes. Mindy's a producer for dome content, and she's like doing crazy theme parks in China. They're awesome. But it's interesting because, you know, we think about, like, what are we actually talking about when we're talking about VR? Are we talking about 360 video, which is perfect for a dome, or are we talking about first-person sensory experience? And this is something that I'm very sort of big on. Like, I'm not really into doing dome content because, I mean, not that I won't. If you need to know dome content, don't call me. But like, because what I'm interested in is the primary sensory experience and how it affects and how it works on the mental models that we all have in our subconscious. You know, scientists have proven, you know, sensory researchers have proven that 60% of what we perceive is actually made up. That our actual sensory input only accounts for about 40% of what we remember or how we perceive a situation. The rest is formed by a pantheon of mental models that resides deep in our subconscious. And this is where I think VR has the potential to really affect change, because primary sensory experience is the most credible and least available driver and creator of that reality engine. Most of it's formed through cultural indoctrination, which is like TV, movies. You know, the mechanism there is enough people around me say that X is true, so I believe X. But you've never actually done X, you know? So here, I want to do a real quick thought experiment, if you'll indulge, if you guys will all indulge me. I want everybody to think about music and dance in Cuba.
Where's my mojito?
Okay, cool. So everybody has a mental model of that, right? And like, I'm just going to do kind of a quick show of hands. Like, how many of you thought about electronic music and rave culture?
Only because I know.
Yeah. Okay, cool. So very few of you, and I'm sure many of you would be surprised to learn that there is actually there is really awesome house music being made in Havana, and that they were throwing, up until the government shut it down, a 30,000 person party called Rotilla on the beaches in just east of Havana. And so we supported a young filmmaker to go down, and like even like Major Lazer didn't know that, and so when he showed up with his whole crew to do a big electronic music show, he didn't bring in any Cuban DJs, even though there are a ton and they're sick, you know. So this is where, I mean, just a kind of a small example of like where we made a VR piece with a young filmmaker that brought you to an underground party that took you through the story of Joy Van Govera, who's the father of Cuban house music, and you know, was mixing on tape decks in the late 90s until DJ Hell showed up and gave him a bunch of turntables and said, "Here, I will give these to you if you promise to throw free parties." And there's a really robust culture there that just wouldn't ever be part of anybody's mental model of Cuba. So anyway, just a small way, but I think that this same mechanism can be used to affect our stereotypes around race, around gender, or around incarceration. So I think that this is a huge opportunity of the medium because of that primary sensory experience and how it works on our subconscious.
How many of you, if the tech was readily available to give the audience choices like in HoloLens, how would you have changed the product that you created? Would you have given more choices to the audience to say, look, you can look here, you can look there? Talk about interactivity for a bit.
There's this constant consideration that goes into conceptualizing content and bringing all the assets together to actually bring it into fruition. And one of them is you have to consider how long you anticipate your production is going to take and where the audience in the marketplace is going to be upon completion. And then also, what is your audience? There are cases where we've produced content for a more kind of gamer-centric user base, in which case you can rely on a lot more interactivity. In the case of the fundraiser that we did for USC, it's a 360 video because we knew that many of the people that we would be putting into a headset were limited in their understandings of the mechanics, and just introducing the concept of being able to look around was going to provide enough of a challenge. This is something that you're going to see grow rapidly. I mean, right now we pretty much have all the major players on the board now. Sony just released their headset last week for the PlayStation. You know, you've got Oculus, you've got Vive, Google Daydream is around the corner, Samsung Gear VR. This is happening really, really fast. And I think the other thing that to consider as well, I often tell a story about it, you know, several years ago, because many of us on this panel have been in this business what seems like an eternity, you know, as Ian says, dog years in VR. Several years ago, I went into an entertainment law firm to you know, give some demos, and one of the partners, you know, older generation, older mindset, essentially had lots of criticisms about it. And to get him to understand, I said, I imagine you represent a lot of YouTube artists. And he says, yeah, we do. And I said, I bet you some of those YouTube artists make more money than your, you know, your average actor. He says, yeah. And I said, and the demographic of the audience is, he had mentioned his granddaughter earlier in the meeting. I said, you know, your granddaughter probably watches a lot of them and watches it on their cell phone, you know, and would rather, and, you know, I don't know if any of you have ever been to VidCon, you know, the YouTube convention. I mean, the kids there scream for these YouTubers like they are the Beatles in the 1960s. It is insane. It was the first time where I felt old in my life. I mean, now I have a son, so I feel old every day. But, you know, it was the first time where I went, oh my God, like I am of a different generation, the first time I went to VidCon. This is something that's really important to consider when you're entering into this space is who's your audience. And without a doubt, I think you're going to see my generation and up being very open to this, but there's a generation that's coming up that this is normal for them. And interactivity, I mean, my kid's 2.5 years old, you know, he'll go up to the television screen on the rare occasion that it's on and he'll try to swipe it because he sees my wife and I swiping our cell phones all the time, right? So there's something that is being built in here that they want, users, audiences want that feedback. So that's going to play more and more of an important role. 360 video is really critical to getting people to discussing VR. But me personally, I want that interactivity. Even if it's the core of it is 360 video, I want some kind of input. I want it to respond to me. And this goes back to Ian's earlier point too of that feel-good moment. That's about empowerment. And part of that empowerment comes from interactivity.
I want to bring up one other topic, and then we're going to turn it over for questions. My friend Stephen Colbert coined a phrase called truthiness. And I want the panel to talk about, I mean, we've been talking about the good uses of VR and eliciting empathy. What happens when it gets in the hands of, let's say, if there was a Hitler today? How do you counteract that kind of force using VR?
Well, I mean, I think a lot about this, and largely the sort of the semiotics of the culture that we're living in now versus the culture of the 20th century, and you know, the culture that gave rise to that kind of top-down hierarchical control, which, you know, we still have, obviously, but it's less. It is less powerful now than I think ever before. I think to sort of speak to your point about the generational shift, Brandon, you know, I say often that we hit the apex of spectator culture in the 20th century, where you identified who you were based on what you liked, right? Were you a fan of the Rolling Stones, or were you a fan of the Beatles, right? Now it doesn't matter. Now you're defined by what you do and by what you offer. So we're no longer in a spectator culture. We are now in a participant culture. And I think that small shift, which has really been powered by the internet, by being able to give upstream feedback to our media devices, and by, you know, a culture, you know, you have groups like Anonymous working now, that, you know, a group like Anonymous could never exist 100 years ago. That would have to be its own whole top-down hierarchical organization, you know, that would sort of have its own. There's a guy, the head of the IEEE, and the world's first cyborg is a guy named Steve Mann, and he talks about this idea of surveillance. So we all know what surveillance is, being viewed from above. Surveillance is being viewed from underneath. And this idea is really powerful. It's how we can hold our governments accountable. It's how we can hold, a dictatorial leader accountable. It's how we can hold our media institutions accountable. And it's chaotic and it's messy, and it doesn't always lead to great things, but it is a counteracting force that we now have access to.
But, I mean, let's say the Ku Klux Klan came out with a brilliant propaganda video. Is this going to end up like when you go see a bad superhero movie and everyone is equally matching it, like, gee, when is this fight going to get over? Because I don't see anyone has a handicap. How it's inevitable. How are we going to deal with this? Or is it just like everything else, there's a good for the internet and there's a bad use for the internet? How do we deal with this?
I think it's a tool, just like all other tools, and it's how we use these tools is what matters. And there's that saying, a hammer can either build bridges or bash brains, and it's like, what do you want to do? So I think that's something that we're all on this panel. That's what we're all doing, is we're being very conscious with the content that we create, because listen, gaming and porn, they're gonna have a great time with this, and there's nothing wrong with that. Let them go do their thing, but we have to have a balance, and we have to be sure that what we're creating, what we're putting out there, is something that we're going to be proud of and feel like that contributes in a real way.
Lori?
I agree. I mean, you can't stop people from using the tools that are available, just like film or just like audio or anything else out there, or the way Twitter's been used or anything, any tool out there. But being that it's a new medium and a new tool, I think the important thing is, people like us and hopefully people like you that want to go out and send good messages and lift people up and shine a light on things that people don't know about and they need to know about, and hopefully we spread more good than bad with this new
Hopefully.
territory.
And I would just add, I think for every sort of misuse of a medium, whether it's video, audio, VR, it tends to galvanize the opposition. So I think in some ways it's inevitable. I think when it does happen, I think the beauty there is it'll likely be met with a much better produced and well thought out response than the original piece itself. So I think that would be my hope, is that this whole community that we're trying to build around this medium would then rally itself to react to that in a really powerful way. And I think that is sort of inherent in the VR community itself, is you see a lot of the content that is actually coming out and is getting headlines is content that's aimed at changing people's minds and sort of perceptions for the better. And that is not indicative of really any other traditional model in sort of film or audio or anything. It never started that way. It always started with entertainment and making you laugh or making you have a great time or hear a great song. And I think VR is actually fairly unique in the sense that there are panels on this tech being used as change agent. And I think that puts us in a good position for the future. Ever the optimist.
All right, I think we'll turn this over for questions. Anybody in the audience want to ask something? Yes.
I didn't hear all the good things, but it's great that we're looking at it through a consciousness. My fear is when we say, oh, let the gamers do what they want. No. Gamers have actually encoded negative messages to kids. They walk around, you're dead, and the suicide rate, we don't have to go to the statistics of what we've seen happen. My question then is, I heard the
No, we haven't, and this is something I've given a lot of thought to, usually in response to questions like this, and it's a valid question. As far as ratings go, and I mean, when you're talking specifically about games, there are rating boards across the globe that rate these things, just like the movie business as well. I think something that, at least my personal takeaway in my experiences in VR, and whether it be from the pure game standpoint or to documentary film or whatever it may be, as I think everybody agrees here, anything you put into VR is just that much more impactful because it's there to simulate reality, right? We want to get the closest to reality as possible. And something that I always point out is you go to see something like Transformers in the movie theater because we've developed enough of a understanding of film language where we need, as a collective, we almost need that kind of grandiose display for it to have any kind of real impact on us, right? I mean, you look at the history of cinema and the kinds of movies that you watch a Buster Keaton film, right? And then you look at Transformers, Buster Keaton was still, amazing and still amazing to this day, but there's a lot more going on a Transformers film now than with Buster Keaton.
But he did it for real.
Right, exactly. With VR, I always say where VR excels is in its subtleties. And it doesn't mean that it can't be action-packed, right? But if I'm in a VR headset and I'm experiencing a giant robot, crushing my house, and it's successful in really transporting me there, that's a very terrifying experience, right? But a potential, creepy person walking by my window in many respects is going to tap into something far more complex than just the fear of flight or to want to run away from this monster. So I have enough faith in this medium and in the storytellers that they're going to recognize that. And you're already seeing it happen. A lot of the early demos that were being worked on by some big players in the game space were abandoned. And it wasn't because they weren't getting initial good responses, but in many cases when you talk about horror, for example, they were too scary. And I think when they really started looking at the marketability of it, they said, this doesn't make business sense. So the marketplace will help dictate that, but part of it is also the responsibility of the creators out there to show the positive power of it. And the other thing is that the definition between gamers or the game industry, and especially with VR and immersive tech, it's a major blending that's happening now, and it's really just about storytelling now, and everybody's using elements and talent from different pools. So it's becoming almost impossible to clearly make that distinction. So have faith in the creators and have faith in the medium. I think we'll be okay.
Let's take another question. Yes.
So I think somebody was talking about how call to action is so critical, and I work with a ton of nonprofits. I could not agree more. I think you guys have such an opportunity to make an immediate impact within media, right? Like touch a button and send a letter to your congressman about this, or just have something in there. So how are you incorporating that so that when people are in the experience and having this emotional connection, people are like, oh God, I have to do something, and then afterwards they're like, oh no, all right, well that happened, just like you said with the car accident, right? So how do you incorporate in a direct call to action in the moment, and how are you also able to measure that?
So can I take this? Because this is something that's really exciting that we're just actually rolling out today for a project. It's for a commercial, of course, but what the commercial allowed us to do was innovate browser-based 360 video with interactive layers. So now for the first time, you can send someone a link on a text message without downloading an app, without hitting any of these kinds of blockades, any of these kinds of extra steps, right? It's very easy for them to click the button. they go and they can watch a fully immersive 360 video. They can hit another button, put it in their Google Cardboard or whatever that you send them that costs, you know, $5 for you to make, and watch the experience. And then at the very end, or at some point of the way through, you can have them gaze over a web link and just hold their gaze and complete
Donate
an
now.
action that affects the real world. What's that?
I want them to look accidentally and hit donate now.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, this is something that like we're bringing online today for the first time. I think ever. I'm not sure. Correct me, please.
Sounds good to me.
But yeah, I mean, it's so I guess the technology is evolving very fast, and you know, honestly, the longer we wait, the better it gets.
I also think there's these rudimentary ways, old school, just because we did screen one of the films at the DNC, the Democratic National Convention in Philly this summer, and immediately after taking off the headsets, we had some of the team ask the participants if it had changed their mind about mass incarceration in the United States, and just kind of taking that poll to see if it even affected them. I think it's really important to get people's real opinion, because they have no reason to say yes if they mean no, if they didn't like it. But ultimately, we're just trying to find out, did the content we create really move the needle for you? Also, Project Empathy is trying to engage USC's Norman Lear Center, which actually measures digital media effect on the public. And we're just trying to figure out how to incorporate them so that when we are able to have these VR experiences in front of larger audiences, we can actually measure how people felt about it, which seems kind of, how do you measure feelings? But that's what they do. So
Just one last note on that. I think the tech is definitely evolving. I think you'll always be able to add a button, gaze at something, get to a link. At the end of the day, it comes down to the creative. It really comes down to the creative. Like one of the most visceral VR experiences for me was a slaughterhouse for pigs.
Oh yeah.
Right?
Oh my
and
God.
like this, we all love bacon. Well, I don't know if we all. I don't know if we all love bacon.
I didn't eat bacon for a month, and
Right?
and I've lived on
Right?
nothing but bacon
and
for
and
weeks.
there was no call to
Yeah,
action.
crazy.
There was no like, click here to donate, go save a pig, adopt Wilbur. None of that. It was just a very visceral experience about where your food comes from, and educating you on a first-person perspective in a very visceral way makes you think twice. And I think that is the power of VR, not to be lost on slapping a button up, but using the medium and that first-person immersiveness in a way to really change people's minds is going to have more an effect than any links or buttons that we can add to it.
Let's see if we can get
I
one.
want to give a call out to that filmmaker. That's Dan Funk Dennis. He was actually a former photojournalist who started doing VR, and his company's called Condition One, and they're based, I think, in Colorado.
Thank you. I'm horrible.
Yeah.
Let's get one more question in. Yes.
San Francisco.
Could you guys talk about funding? Because how do you fund those projects when there's no audience to pay for it?
We're all self-funders, I think.
Are we?
Aren't we?
No. No.
You're not? Oh, you got to tell us your secrets then.
Oh, well, okay. So actually, it's funny because I was at VR on the Lot at Paramount last week, and the big question was, all right, how do we make money on this? Now, and I don't mean to say I have the answer, but I mean, we're not self-funded. We've gotten money, obviously, because we have Ken Burns and Time Magazine, so that's easier to get money. But something that at least points us in the right direction of how to make money on this is that I got an email during the conference that the Defying the Nazis film, the Ken Burns film, had got 1.4 billion media impressions, and 40% of that came from Time Magazine and the VR experience. So
cool.
That's at least as pointing. Yeah, that's a sign. Did you not know this?
Oh.
Yeah, isn't that cool? But that's a sign in the right direction.
I'm
Of
gonna make a T-shirt.
exactly right. Like, let's at least add that to the VR Playhouse pitch deck or something.
I think you also have to go to where the money is, which in a lot of places is the hardware platforms tend to have content budgets set aside for content acquisition and content production. We spoke a little bit earlier about programs that are specifically designed at certain groups. Those all exist. Look at partners. This is, like I said, I keep saying this, it's very much a community. So find somebody else that has a distribution platform and an audience already in place and pitch them your idea. There's many platforms that need content and need storytellers still. So that's in terms of getting something off the ground, not necessarily making money.
That's not necessarily
That's not true.
And-
That's
and
definitely not
The other
true.
thing is the majority of you are in here, because we've gotten paid plenty, through stuff that we've developed for these tech partners and for other platforms. There is money out there, and you're all here because you're interested in cause-related media. In most cases, if it's a legitimate cause, there are people out there with money who are supporting those causes, and you need to go find them. This is how we got the ARC, our documentary on the rhinoceros, funded. That is not a money maker piece. That is a passion piece. That is something that we found individuals who were passionate about that cause and put the money up, and they're proud to say that they're associated with it. You've got to be creative. It just in the same way that you go out and you make a film and you try to figure out how you're going to get it financed. And if you can come up with a larger business strategy, where you can justify a regular funding coming in, then there's money out there for that as well.
Let's see if we can get one more question. Yes.
We were on your top door, and then not resistant, still for Untitled, but then a lot of the people watching this program and shows after a while it off and want to be immersive environment, collective audience. So have you done anything that with VR, augmented reality, that creates a 3D type experience? I noticed in China they're already wiring up phones at 500 meg type.
I think this goes back to kind of the dome, different modes of different means of projection and display. Part of it is for the creators that are in the audience. You have to develop an understanding of the overall landscape of all the tools that are available to you, because oftentimes it doesn't take a huge adjustment to get your piece of content into a different type of display or a different way of delivering it to your audience. And that's also going to affect the choices that you make in the actual production of it as well. So part of it is just knowing what tools are out there, how you're going to get it to your audience, and then producing your content so that you can take advantage of that. But yeah, AR, VR, projection dome, projection globes, cell phone, high-end HNDs, you name it, you've got to weigh all of those things when you go to create your content.
Let's try one more question. Yes.
Hi, and thank you. It's a great panel as well. I just want to pick up on the thread of interactivity and participatory. So we're saying let's trust the creators, and to some extent we're trusting the distributors, the publishers. If we start to involve the audience, what are the audience expectations? What happens when they become more interactive than just clicking on a donate email button? Do we trust our audience, and how do we do that? How do we stay involved?
Well, I think a lot of it has to do with just even how the news business changed from, it used to be you get the newspaper and what we tell you on the front page is what you believe, and I doubt that we live in that era so much anymore. Once newspapers went digital and opened it up to comments, you started to see the audience comment back on what they either wanted to see or what they believed or didn't, or arguments, moral arguments about whatever the news of the day might be. I kind of see something similar that could happen in VR, especially around social issues, where perhaps you are hopefully changing people's minds about social issues they didn't know about. We hope that the participation of the audience is a positive event and that we can create experiences where they feel positively affected. That's not to say that, I think as we've set up here, we're not going to take you necessarily into experiences you're going to like. It's not necessarily about entertainment, it's really about education. And I really hope that people can sort of participate in that. What that actually looks like, I'm not really sure yet. I think that even with the 4 directors that we have, they've all taken very different approaches to what they think an audience member wants to see out of the mass incarceration issue and what they think the audience needs to see. So we had a discussion beforehand about morally, how much do you show people what happens in a prison? And that is something that crossed each of our directors' minds as they went into this. Add the layer of participation and it gets even more morally tricky. So especially if it's somebody's the first person. So I think there's a lot to be explored.
Well, sadly, all good things must come to an end. This is an important dialogue that undoubtedly needs to continue. I want to thank this great panel and the audience. So let's give the panel a round of applause.